Let us begin with a truth that history whispers again and again, though we rarely pause to hear it clearly. It does not take entire armies, governments, or empires to redirect the fate of nations. Often it takes just one person, one human being who sees a moment not as the world sees it, but as it could be. Someone who, in the middle of overwhelming power, steps forward with clarity and conviction. Think about it: all progress, all revolutions, all great shifts in the relationship between nations are born not from faceless masses, but from the courage of individuals who choose to act when others remain silent. When we talk about US-India relations, we are speaking about one of the most complex and significant partnerships of the modern world. Economically, militarily, strategically, yes, these things matter. But beneath the surface of treaties, trade agreements, and official visits lies something deeper: the psychology of respect, the philosophy of dignity, and the power of moral courage. And in this vast arena of global diplomacy, one Indian at one critical moment embodied that courage, changing not only how America looked at India, but how India looked at itself. You see, nations are like individuals in many ways. They wrestle with questions of self-worth, they are tempted to compromise their principles for short-term gains, and they struggle with the fear of being overshadowed by stronger powers. But just as in human life, the true test of character comes when a choice must be made under pressure: do I yield, or do I stand firm? And when one person dares to stand firm, they do more than save face, they ignite a transformation. Suddenly, a country realizes that its voice matters, that it does not have to bow, that its dignity is not up for negotiation. That awakening is contagious. It seeps into the national psyche and reshapes destiny. Think about the great turning points in history. One leader who refused to step aside, one thinker who refused to conform, one reformer who refused to be silenced. Their choices did not merely affect their own lives, they shifted the trajectory of entire civilizations. In the same way, this Indian figure demonstrated that the balance of power in international relations is not only about weapons or wealth, but about willpower. The willpower to say, we will chart our own course, even if the path is difficult. And what is so striking is that this principle is not confined to the grand stage of geopolitics. It echoes in our own personal lives. Every one of us faces moments where the pressure to bend is immense, where yielding seems easier than holding our ground. Yet history reminds us that one voice, one act of courage, one refusal to compromise on truth can ripple outward in ways we cannot yet imagine. So when you think of this story, do not see it merely as a lesson in foreign policy. See it as a mirror reflecting back at you. One Indian changed the course of US-India relations, not because he had more power than America, but because he had more conviction than fear. And that, my friends, is a power every one of us holds within. Never underestimate the force of a single individual with unshakable resolve, for it is always the few, the brave, the daring, who remind the world that history is not written by the powerful, but by the steadfast. There comes a moment in the life of every individual, and equally in the life of every nation, when the pressure to conform becomes nearly unbearable. It is that moment of confrontation, when one stands face to face with immense power, and the world watches to see whether dignity will triumph over fear. In the story of US-India relations, such a moment arrived, and it was not met by hesitation, nor by retreat, but by one Indian who chose to stand tall. And it was that act, that refusal to bend under the shadow of a global superpower, that altered the balance of respect between the two nations. We often imagine power as something measured in numbers, military strength, economic resources, political influence. But in reality, power is also psychological. It is the ability to impose your will on another, to make them yield without firing a shot. The United States, with its unmatched influence, has long known how to wield such pressure. Many countries have bent to it, some willingly, others reluctantly. But when this Indian figure was faced with it, the choice was clear: surrender India's sovereignty for temporary comfort, or embrace the discomfort of defiance in order to preserve the nation's self-respect. He chose the latter, and in that moment, the confrontation was no longer just political, it was moral, and here lies the beauty of it. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Imagine the stakes at that moment: the risk of sanctions, the possibility of isolation, the threat of strained ties with a dominant superpower. For many, these dangers would have been enough to justify compromise. But there are times when compromise corrodes the very soul of a nation. To yield in such a moment would not have been pragmatism, but submission, and submission, once accepted, becomes a habit that weakens both individuals and nations alike. Standing firm against pressure is not only an act of defiance, it is a declaration of identity. It tells the world, we know who we are, and we will not be defined by the terms others impose upon us. That declaration reverberated far beyond diplomacy. It shifted the psychological dynamic, forcing the United States to reconsider how it engaged with India. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned, and in that defining moment, respect was earned not through compliance, but through courage. But let us not keep this lesson confined to the realm of geopolitics. Each of us in our own lives faces the same confrontation in different forms. We feel the pressure of expectations, the weight of authority, the temptation to yield for convenience's sake. The question is not whether we will feel that pressure, but whether we will have the courage to resist it when the moment demands it. One Indian's refusal to yield under global pressure became a turning point for a nation. And for us, it is a reminder that the measure of true strength is not in how loudly we speak, but in how firmly we stand when the world expects us to fall. What followed that moment of defiance was more than a political shift, it was a psychological awakening. For decades, India had been seen through the lens of limitation, a developing nation struggling with poverty, often cautious on the world stage, sometimes even hesitant to assert itself. The West, and particularly the United States, had grown accustomed to viewing India as important but secondary, a country that would adapt rather than lead, that would listen more than it would command attention. But when one individual chose to resist, the narrative changed. Suddenly, India was not a quiet participant in global affairs. It was a voice that demanded to be heard, a presence that could not be dismissed. This is the deeper significance of that confrontation. It was not only about foreign policy, it was about identity. Nations, like people, live by the stories they tell themselves and the stories others tell about them. If you are told long enough that you are weak, you begin to believe it. If you are treated as though your choices do not matter, you may internalize that irrelevance. And once that story settles into your consciousness, it becomes self-fulfilling. What happened in that pivotal moment was that India, through the courage of one representative, refused to accept the narrative that it was lesser, that it must always yield. The act of standing firm was not just a negotiation tactic, it was a declaration of selfhood on the global stage. And notice how this mirrors the struggles within the human soul. Each of us is constantly engaged in a quiet battle between the stories imposed upon us and the story we choose to live. The world may call you insignificant. Your circumstances may try to convince you that you cannot change much, and sometimes even your own doubts whisper that you are not strong enough. But when you act from conviction, when you assert your dignity, you do more than change the way others see you. You change the way you see yourself. That is liberation. That is the birth of a new identity. For India, that act of defiance planted a seed of self-respect that began to grow in unexpected ways. The world saw a nation unwilling to be bullied, and India saw itself as a nation capable of shaping its own destiny. Respect, once earned, alters relationships permanently. It creates a new equilibrium where dialogue replaces dictation and partnership replaces dominance. This is why the story of one Indian's decision is more than an episode in diplomacy. It is a lesson in psychology, in philosophy, in the timeless truth that dignity is the cornerstone of freedom. The same principle applies to us. If we do not define ourselves, the world will define us, and if we do not claim our dignity, others will dictate our worth. That moment showed us something profound, that identity is not granted, it is claimed. And once it is claimed, no force on earth can take it away. What makes that act of defiance so remarkable is not only the courage it displayed in the moment, but the ripple effect it produced in the years that followed. International relations are not transformed overnight, they evolve through a long chain of reactions, each one shaped by subtle shifts in perception. When one Indian stood firm against overwhelming U.S. pressure, the immediate outcome may have seemed like a confrontation. But beneath the surface, something much deeper was taking place. The psychology of the relationship itself was being rewritten. Up to that point, the balance of power between the United States and India was tilted heavily toward one side. America was the global superpower, accustomed to setting terms, and India, though proud and sovereign, was often expected to comply. Yet, when India refused to bend, it introduced a new dynamic, respect born not of submission, but of strength. From that moment on, the U.S. could no longer afford to treat India as a passive participant in global affairs. Instead, it had to recognize India as a serious partner, one whose decisions carried weight and whose independence could not be casually dismissed. This shift may sound abstract, but its consequences were profound. In diplomacy, perception is power. If a nation is seen as weak, its voice is ignored. If it is seen as strong, its voice is sought after. That single moment of defiance forced Washington to reconsider its calculus. Dialogue, not dictation, became the basis of future engagement. Trade negotiations, strategic discussions, even military cooperation began to unfold under this new psychology of mutual recognition. In many ways, it was the beginning of a transformation that led to the strong, multifaceted US-India relationship we see today. But the most important lesson lies not in the geopolitical outcome, but in the universal principle it reveals. Respect, whether between nations, between communities, or between individuals, is never granted to those who simply comply. It is earned by those who are willing to stand their ground. Even when it costs them something in the short term, compliance may win temporary peace, but it never wins lasting respect. Only courage does that. And here is the part we often overlook. Those ripples extend inward as much as outward. Just as the United States was forced to reassess India, India itself began to reassess its own identity. That one moment showed an entire nation that it could demand recognition without fear, that it had the right to stand as an equal in the global arena. It was not just America's perception that changed, it was India's perception of itself. And when a nation begins to believe in its own strength, its future can never again be the same. So let us remember this: the ripples of courage reach farther than we can imagine. One decision, one act of integrity can reshape relationships, redefine identities, and reframe destinies. Stand firm once, and you may just find that the world itself begins to shift around you. When we step back and look at this story, we see that it is not only about the relationship between two nations, it is also about the deeper lessons of leadership and of life itself. Because what played out on the grand stage of diplomacy is, in truth, the very same struggle that each of us faces in our personal journey. The confrontation between India and the United States was a test of integrity under pressure, a test of whether principles could stand firm against the temptation of compromise. And that is a test that comes to all of us, though on smaller stages and in quieter ways. Think about the choices we are faced with daily. There is always the easy path, the one that avoids conflict, that buys temporary comfort at the cost of long-term respect. And then there is the harder path, the one that risks discomfort, criticism, or even isolation, but preserves our integrity and affirms our dignity. Nations are judged by how they respond in such moments. So are individuals. The lesson of this Indian leader's courage is that respect, whether from a global superpower or from the people around you, comes not when you yield, but when you refuse to betray your own principles. Leadership at its core is not about titles or authority. It is about the ability to stand in the fire of pressure and remain unmoved in your conviction. And that kind of leadership is not restricted to presidents or prime ministers. Parents lead when they set examples for their children. Teachers lead when they stand for truth in the classroom. Workers lead when they refuse to compromise on honesty. Each of us carries within us the same power to change the dynamics of our environment as that one Indian did on the global stage. Philosophically, this is rooted in a timeless truth. External power can only dominate you if you surrender your internal power first. Once you give away your integrity, the battle is already lost. But if you keep hold of it, no matter the pressure, you command a strength that even the greatest external force cannot overcome. That is why one act of courage from one person can recalibrate entire relationships, be they between nations or within families, communities, or workplaces. This is what makes the story so inspiring. It is not just about a prime minister standing up to a superpower. It is about the human spirit refusing to bend when bending would mean breaking. And if one individual can change the course of international relations by clinging to principle, imagine what you can change in your own world by doing the same. The truth is simple, yet profound. When you honor your principles above your fears, you gain something no one can take from you: respect. And respect, once earned, has the power to transform not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. The legacy of that single act of courage is far greater than the political consequences it produced. Policies change, treaties are signed and broken, alliances shift with time, but what endures is the example, the living memory of someone who refused to bend when it would have been easier to yield. That is the true inheritance left by one Indian who stood against overwhelming odds, not just a new chapter in US-India relations, but a timeless reminder of what conviction can achieve. Think of how legacies are formed. They are not built on comfort or compromise. They are built on those rare moments when an individual chooses principle over convenience. History remembers such people not because they had the loudest voices, but because their silence could not be bought, their dignity could not be negotiated. And when future generations look back on them, they see more than a leader or a diplomat. They see a mirror of what is possible in themselves. This is why one person's courage can outlive them by decades, even centuries. The act itself may have been brief, but the echo it created continues to inspire. It tells us that greatness is not measured by the size of your power, but by the strength of your stance. It tells us that respect in any relationship, between nations or between individuals, is secured not by compromise, but by clarity of principle. And it tells us that even the mightiest of powers must bow, eventually, to the force of integrity. But let us not imagine that this legacy belongs only to history books. It belongs to you. Because what that moment proved is that the line between ordinary life and extraordinary impact is thinner than we think. One choice, one stand, one refusal to surrender your dignity can set an example that inspires others long after you are gone. Just as nations were forced to look at India differently, the people around you will begin to look at you differently when they see that you will not betray your principles. And that shift, the shift from compliance to respect, is what changes the course of a life. Philosophers have long argued that the truest form of power is moral power. Military might may win battles, economic strength may build empires, but moral power, the courage to live by principle, wins something greater. It wins the future. That is why the story of this Indian's defiance matters so much today. It is not simply a story of geopolitics, it is a call to each of us to find that same courage within ourselves, to live in such a way that our example outlasts our presence. And so the legacy of one act of courage continues, not just in the relationship between two great nations, but in the hearts of those who draw strength from it. Remember this: policies fade, power shifts, but courage endures. And it is courage, more than anything else, that writes the final word in history.